He was born into velvet, marble, and prophecy. A prince whose first breath echoed through the royal halls of Copenhagen, where every candle burned a little brighter that night. Christian, heir to Denmark and Norway, was meant to be the golden link in a chain of kings. The court called him handsome, clever, and blessed. Yet even in his cradle, there was something restless in his gaze, an uncertainty behind the charm, a nervous flicker that made the servants cross themselves when no one watched. As he grew, the world around him sharpened. Tutors taught him Latin, philosophy, the art of kingship. But Christian did not listen. He would laugh mid-lesson, mock his teachers, or stare blankly out the window as if hearing voices carried on the wind. When punished, he would scream until his throat gave out, then whisper apologies that never sounded sincere. The boy who was born to rule was already drifting into darkness, and no one dared speak it aloud. When his father died, the crown came too soon. 17 years old, a boy forced into a man's throne. The coronation bells rang across Denmark, but in Christian's mind they were not bells, they were chains. The golden weight of power pressed upon him like an invisible hand. He smiled for the crowd, bowed for the clergy, but behind the smile his thoughts fractured into 1,000 shards of fear. The courtiers whispered, though never loudly enough to be heard. They spoke of his moods, how 1 hour he'd embrace them with laughter, and the next rage and strike out like a child denied a toy. He insulted nobles to their faces, humiliated them at banquets, and filled the palace with manic laughter that made servants tremble in the dark. They called him the Mad Prince, though only in secret, for to call a king mad was treason, even if every soul could see it. At night, the palace came alive with his footsteps. The guards heard him talking to ghosts that weren't there. He danced with invisible partners in the grand hall, spinning until he collapsed on the cold marble floor, muttering that demons clawed at his mind. Some said he was cursed, others said possessed, but the truth was crueler. The boy had been broken by the crown before he'd ever learned to wear it. Then came his marriage, a political bond forged not from love but from alliance. Caroline Matilda, a princess of England, barely 16. She was delicate, kind, and full of hope. When she arrived, she expected a husband, a partner, a king. What she found was a man trapped inside his own reflection. Christian adored her one moment, despised her the next. He mocked her accent, laughed at her tears, and then begged for forgiveness like a lost child. He was jealous of her affection, yet incapable of giving love in return. He hurled insults across the royal table, then fell to his knees and wept, kissing her hands and promising to be better. The palace became a theater of heartbreak, the actors unwilling and afraid. His nights grew darker. He took to roaming the city in disguise, visiting taverns and brothels, mingling with criminals as if to escape the suffocating air of royalty. He beat his servants without reason, scrawled nonsense on royal decrees, and ordered absurd public spectacles that mocked his own nobility. Denmark's throne had become a stage for a performance no one dared end. The ministers tried to govern through him, to mask his madness with polite deception. But there was no disguising the truth. Their king was no longer among the sane. And then one winter night, everything changed. The court physician fell ill, and in his place came a new doctor, a quiet, confident man with sharp eyes and calm words. Johann Friedrich Struensee. Where others feared the king, Struensee listened. He spoke to Christian not as a monarch but as a man. He steadied his trembling hands, soothed his rages, and brought rare moments of peace to the storm-tossed king. It was said that when Struensee entered the room, Christian's laughter softened, his madness eased, if only for a while. The courtiers were astonished. Some whispered it was sorcery, others divine intervention. But one truth was certain. For the first time in years, Denmark had hope. Yet power is a dangerous medicine, and the line between healer and ruler is thin. As Struensee's influence over the king grew, so too did the envy and suspicion of the court. The whispers began anew, this time about the doctor. For in the world of crowns, saving a king's mind could be the very thing that seals your doom. At first it seemed like a miracle. The kingdom that had been held hostage by a boy king's madness began to breathe again. Christian smiled in public. He signed decrees with purpose. He spoke of reform, progress, reason, words no one had heard from his lips before. And always, behind him, a shadow moved quietly, the physician Johann Friedrich Struensee. He became the king's voice, his confidant, his anchor. Every royal order passed through his hands, every whisper of policy began with his breath. He spoke softly, but his ideas carried the weight of revolution. He abolished torture, granted freedom to the press, reformed the laws of poverty and disease. For a moment in history, Denmark stood on the edge of enlightenment, all because one man dared to treat madness with compassion. But compassion is not a language spoken easily in courts of power. The nobles seethed, robbed of their influence. The church whispered of heresy. And as Struensee's star rose higher, his enemies began to see in him not a doctor, but a usurper wearing a healer's smile. The king adored him like a brother, and the queen, poor lonely Caroline Matilda, found in him something far deeper. She had spent years as a prisoner in a gilded cage, her husband's cruelty the only constant in her days. But Struensee looked at her as if she were human, not royal property. Their words became glances, their glances became silence, and that silence soon turned to forbidden touch. They thought their love was secret. But in a palace of spies and whispers, nothing remains hidden for long. Servants began to talk. Letters disappeared. Eyes followed them in the corridors. And yet neither could stop, for in each other they found what the crown had denied them both, a kind of freedom. Christian saw it too, in the strange way his wife smiled now, in the gentleness with which his doctor addressed her. Sometimes he laughed it off, sometimes he screamed in jealous fury. Then, forgetting, he'd invite them both to dine and toast their friendship as if his mind refused to connect the dots. The madness that once raged like fire had dimmed into a kind of fog, and through that fog, others began to rule. The king signed decrees he no longer read. His name appeared on laws he barely understood. The nobles, enraged, saw Denmark slipping from their grasp, not to their monarch, but to two lovers who defied tradition, God, and nation. Whispers turned to venom. The queen's reputation blackened. The doctor was called an impostor, a foreigner, a corrupter of both monarch and morality. And still, Struensee pushed forward, building schools, breaking chains, daring to imagine a Denmark that belonged to its people, not its palace. But the palace does not forgive rebellion, especially the kind that hides behind love. The queen soon gave birth to a daughter. The king, oblivious or unwilling, accepted her as his own. But in the eyes of the court, that child was not royal. She was scandal incarnate, living proof of betrayal. By now the knives were being sharpened. Enemies gathered in drawing rooms and whispered in candlelight. They painted Struensee as a devil in disguise, a puppet master who controlled the king, defiled the queen, and mocked the nobility. They swore that Denmark must be cleansed, not with reform but with blood. The storm was coming. And when it broke, it would sweep away everyone, the mad king, the queen who loved in secret, and the doctor who thought he could heal a nation's soul. It began with a whisper, as most executions do. A midnight carriage. A letter sealed in red. The sound of boots against marble, echoing like the pulse of fate. The queen was awakened by torchlight. The doctor was dragged from his bed, half-dressed, his face still marked with sleep and disbelief. The coup had begun. The nobles moved swiftly, armed not with honor but with fear. Christian the king was caught between them, dazed, confused, his mind a fog of half-truths and manipulation. They told him the doctor had betrayed him, that his beloved wife had dishonored his throne. They fed his madness with lies, knowing he would believe them. And he did. Struensee, the man who had calmed his storms, was now branded a serpent. The queen, who had once smiled through his madness, was called an adulteress. And Christian, trembling, broken, signed the orders for their arrest. The doctor was thrown into a dungeon of damp stone and silence. Days turned to weeks, marked only by the scratching of rats and the whispers of guards. He was beaten, humiliated, denied sleep. They demanded confessions, of sin, of pride, of treason. At first he refused. Then when they brought him the Queen's name, he broke. Caroline Matilda, once the bright flame of the Danish court, was exiled to a distant fortress. Her children taken from her arms, her crown stripped away, her love reduced to rumor. They said she wandered the halls at night, clutching a lock of her daughter's hair, whispering Struensee's name to the cold stone. She was 23. She would never see Denmark again. And the doctor, the man who had healed a king, met his end on a gray April morning. They dragged him through the streets of Copenhagen, the crowd jeering, priests chanting. His hands were bound, his eyes calm as though he had already left this world behind. He spoke no final words. There was nothing left to say. The blade fell, swift and merciless. His body was cut down, his head displayed as warning. The crowd watched in silence, some in hatred, some in pity. Few remembered that he had once freed them from their chains. And the king remained. Christian VII lived on for years, more a ghost than a ruler. The laughter returned, hollow now, echoing through empty chambers. He would speak to shadows, bow to no one, and forget the names of those he had loved. He signed papers placed before him without reading them, the ink trembling from his unsteady hand. Denmark continued to rule in his name, but the throne was empty long before his death. The boy who had danced with ghosts was now one himself. History calls him the Mad King of Denmark. But perhaps madness was not his crime, only his curse. He was born into a world that demanded perfection, yet gave him no mercy. A child crowned too soon, loved too little, and controlled by those who feared him most. In the end, his story is not one of tyranny, but of tragedy. A kingdom lost not to war or rebellion, but to the frailty of the human mind. And so the feast ended, not with a roar, but with silence. The candles burned low. The music faded. And the throne of Denmark sat beneath the weight of madness and memory, waiting for the next soul who would dare to wear its crown.